So yesterday I had given you a brief motivation as to why fairness and balance have been studied in the journalism literature for some time. So, and in fact, like these studies date back to 1990s. Like, so it has been there. The ideas have been there for a very long time. So this whole thing actually comes from uh, the sociology literature, which talks about certain social responsibilities of journalists. Okay, so basically, I think like we have talked about earlier also that journalists should limit their own freedom while expressing um, uh, like a content. So if they are covering a news, they should be completely unbiased. And there should not be like any personal opinion or personal choices that should get reflected in the writing. Okay, so in fact, like one of the largest encyclopedia, Wikipedia, also works on this particular principle, which is, uh, I think I have already told you once. So this is the NPOV guideline, or the neutral point of view. So yeah, so that is what is being talked about. So they should ensure, they have the responsibility to ensure that all the voices are being represented almost equally in any public debate. And so there was this Commission on Freedom of Press, this was one of the earliest commissions which laid the foundation of the kind of responsibilities that a journalist and a media outlet as a whole has. Okay, so there should be less partisan approach to news reporting. So it should be as less biased as possible, right? And mm, like when there is a controversial issue, the newspaper should actually cover both the sides of the controversies, with almost equal limelight. Okay, so this is something that is very important. Like if you suppress one part of the controversy and present the other, that could have very strong ramifications among the mass that is consuming the uh, news. So therefore, that is a very serious responsibility, especially in case of controversial issues. Okay, so now there are three important tenets of responsibility. One is accuracy. For instance, like there should be always a motive to present the most accurate news or the most pure form of news. And then there are two other components or two other tenets, the fairness and the balance issue. So these are the two things that the authors define in this paper, and do some very interesting experiments to uh, show, like, so these are very simple but very interesting experiments to show like the differences between what they call the prestige press versus news outlets with large circulation. Okay, so on one side is the prestige press. So as the name suggests, like these are like very prestigious news media outlets. And on the other side, there are news outlets like which have a very large circulation. Okay, so they try to compare these two types of press based on the uh, two tenets, fairness and balance. But as we have already noted earlier also that for any such study, one needs a proper operationalization of what is meant by fairness and what is meant by balance. So the first thing that we will do in the next few slides is to formally define fairness and balance. So yeah, so this is what I said. The hypothesis of the paper is that uh, for any local controversy that is coming up, um, both sides of the controversy should be presented well. And what the authors felt or hypothesized is that these local controversies will be better, represented in the prestige press compared to the large circulation newspapers. Okay, so that was their hypothesis with which they started. So, so their claim was that for any local controversy, you have coverage by prestige press and you have coverage by large circulation newspapers. Now, the author's hypothesis is that this one, number one, is more fair and balanced than number two. Okay, so that is what is their hypothesis. And they will do a bunch of experiments in order to substantiate or corroborate this hypothesis. Now, the data set that they consider is the following. So they curate 21 newspapers. Out of them, 9 are known to be prestige papers and 12 are the largest circulation daily newspapers. So this was a US-based study. Okay. So what were the topics of the news stories that they looked into? Typically, some sort of a defamation in controversial local stories. Okay, so that was the topic of the stories that they chose to work with. Okay, and what do you mean by local? So these are marked by standard metropolitan statistical area. Okay, so in which the newspaper is located. So basically, these are well designated areas like in the US, and the authors actually just took the same definition and went forward. Okay, now the controversies were related to the local government, the local public education, and local business. Okay, so these were the three different like paradigms in which they look for controversies, and the controversies is always of the type of some sort of a defamation. Okay, so now you have to annotate, right, these news stories. So what the authors did was they appointed two independent annotators to annotate the stories, and then there was a third annotator who made the final judgment. So this the third annotator was an adjudicator. So this third annotator was an adjudicator. So he or she looked into the judgments of the individual annotations, and wherever there was a discrepancy, the person came up with the final verdict. And they considered stories between April 21 to 26, 1986. Okay, and they covered like around 343 stories. So these 343 stories were all controversies taken from some local issue. Okay, and this issue could be related to government, public education, or local business. So basically, if you see carefully, these are issues related to, I mean, this translates to issues related to politics, education at a broader scale, and finance. Okay, so these were the three broader level like issues that were kind of considered. Now, what did they do? So as I said, like these annotators were given the task of like marking something as fair or unfair, marking something with a balance score. Okay, so how would they do that? So you need to have a proper guideline that operationalizes what is fairness and what is balance. So now uh, fairness is defined. So this is a very, very simplistic definition of fairness, but it seems like very intuitive also. So they conceived of fairness uh, as like being guided by one of these four factors. So a story could have both sides of the controversy successfully contacted. Okay, so when a journalist is making up a story, the journalist have successfully contacted both the sides of the controversy and have taken their viewpoints on the controversy and have written it down or notified it to the press, and the press has like almost equally covered both the sides. That is one thing. The second thing is an explicit statement that one side refused to comment. So if that is not possible, if the first case is not possible, okay, then there should be a remark made by the journalist that one of the sides, so he or she tried to contact them and made every effort to get in touch and get their viewpoints, but then the party refused, okay, to comment. The third one is that an explicit statement that one side could not be contacted, because sometimes there is a pressure that the news has to be published very fast. It has to go to the press within say 24 hours, and like within that short time sometimes it becomes extremely difficult to contact. But then an explicit statement should be given in the news article that one of the sides has not been contacted, so it was not possible to contact one of the sides. So this actually reduces like people's like um, kind of overall faith on the news. They know, oh, okay, one side has not been contacted, so we might take this news as like half baked or like a half information, and we should wait for the other party also to speak up. And then the third one was no contact was made with one side of the controversy, and there has been no explanation given in the news article whatsoever that why they were not contacted. Okay, so these are the four like um, sorry, these are the four different guidelines trying to bring out the fairness, okay, or trying to operationalize fairness. Now like it becomes extremely difficult to do some statistically meaningful study if you have so many classes and just 343 stories. So therefore the authors went on to further subcategorize the whole thing, or like collapse the classes into two major classes. So one was 1, 2, 3, and the other one was 4. So 1, 2, 3 together is like kind of some sort of fairness is involved, whereas 4 is, so these are like fair, while the fourth class is unfair. So basically, either a successful contact has been made and the coverage has been done, or like an explicit like mention has been done, either that the party has refused to comment or the party could not be contacted. While the fourth one is like nothing of this sort has been mentioned and no contact has been made with the parties, and this has not also been explicitly stated in the news. Okay, so and as I was telling you, like there are pressures on the reporter to like source the news before deadline, and therefore sometimes it's very difficult to reach the both the parties within time to you know, get their opinions, get their viewpoints, but then that should be explicitly mentioned somewhere in the news. The second thing was like how to operationalize balance. So recall that this was in the era of 1990s, right? At this time, like most of it was print media. So rarely like online media was used at that time for consumption of news. So in the news, in the print media, what made sense, like the way the authors quantified balance was trying to measure words per inch. Okay, so they tried to measure, like given a particular space in the entire newspaper, uh, say suppose the newspaper has different columns, and in one of the columns the controversy is being covered. So now you measure the words per inch uh, like that has been given to to each of the parties involved in the controversy. Okay, so and one tried to see like uh, how much words per inch has been given to each of the individual uh, like players in the controversy. So but why do you think so what is this measuring actually? These days, if you were to measure something similar, what would you do? You would just count the number of words or count the number of characters. This is something that we have seen. Like, but why is this words per inch uh, important? And like, what is this actually measuring? Okay, let me give you the answer. So this is measuring the coverage. Okay, so the coverage of each side of the controversy. Right? So how much space has been allocated? So coverage in terms of space. So how much space has been dedicated to each of the side of the controversy? That is what is being measured by this word per inch formula. Okay. So yeah, and this also like accounts for like bold type, density of the type, the weights of the column, etc., etc. So now what they did was the annotators found out like who are the prominent entities or prominent role players in this controversy. And then they counted the number of words for those. So this is not just words per inch, for those entities. Okay, so say there are two major entities, E1 and E2, say two political entities or two business entities. So E1 and E2, they counted like the words per inch for E1 and words per inch for E2. Okay, now then they found out the average difference in percentage of the total story length, like given to the two sides of the controversy. So basically what they found out was something like WPI E1 minus WPI E2 divided by WPI of the whole news article or the news story. Let's call it S, and that expressed as a percentage. Okay, so this is the difference percentage that they tried to compute. Okay, now uh, uh, so you have like 9 prestige press articles and you have 12 uh, uh, like um, large media circulation articles. Now you had some X number of stories here, and you have some Y number of stories here. So this X plus Y together made 343 stories. Okay. Now you computed the average. So let's call this score W, average W for all the X stories, and here you have average W of all the Y stories, and this is what you compare. Okay, so this is how you quantify balance. Okay, so now you have the quantification for fairness as well as the quantification for balance, and now you can try to compare the prestige press versus the large media circulation or large circulation newspapers, and see like if the author's hypothesis that one is more fair than the other and one is more balanced than the other holds or not. Okay. So now they also did some like additional experiments to see whether the annotations that they obtained from the annotators are reliable or not. And these are like standard metrics that we have already studied earlier, like inter-annotator agreement. So after like coding 25 stories, like they studied the inter-annotator agreement, and the agreement was like 100%. Okay, so basically for fairness the agreement was 100%. So like they took the 25% stories, like out of 343 stories, whenever 25% stories were coded, like they immediately took this and like looked into the inter-annotator agreement, and they found that the inter-annotator agreement was 100%, and therefore they had no doubt that for the rest of the annotations, rest of the 75% annotations also, like this is going to be true. Okay, so for the balance, like since this is a words per inch kind of a formula, it's a bit more difficult. Okay, so and it depends largely on the perception of the annotators. Fine. So what they did was like to see like there is not a starking difference between not a stark difference between the different annotators. What they did was for each annotator they asked them to code 4 stories. Okay, and they found out the words per inch uh, counts for each of these 4 stories for each of the parties. okay, for each of the two parties in the controversy. Now they ran a t-test, okay, they ran a t-test to find the p-value, okay, and they saw that the p-value is not significant, which means that the differences in the codings of the four annotators are not significant. Okay, so that means they are, so in other words, they are similar, and this could be accepted. So if the p-value was significant, so that would mean that the annotators are differently perceiving the words per inch. Okay, so the balance metric is being differently perceived by the different annotators, but that did not happen. The authors comfortably saw that the p-values are not significant, and therefore whatever perception one annotator has is not very different from another annotator. Okay, so and therefore this could be taken forward. So with this assurance on the reliability of the annotations, the authors finally did their experiments. So as you see, so these are the different news outlets that the authors chose. Okay, so these 9 are the prestige press. Okay, and these are like very well known and like earmarked as prestige press by the journalistic literature. Okay, and these are like large circulation newspapers. So these are 9 in number, these are 12 in number, and the 343 stories are distributed across the different news outlets as follows. Okay, so some of the mm, like uh, news outlets that have a lot of stories are the New York Times. Uh, okay, that's one of the largest, and also no. So I think this is not New York Times. This is St. Louis Post. Okay, and then the St. Louis Post Dispatch, and then the second one in row is Washington Post, and this is the average. Okay, so the average number of news stories that have been taken from these 9 media outlets is 14. Okay, for the 12 highly circulated newspapers, also this one has the largest number of news stories covered, but the average is very similar to that of the prestige press. Okay, so the authors tried to balance out the average. So the total number of newspapers or news stories that have been taken from the prestige press is very similar to the total number of news stories that is taken from the high circulation newspapers. Okay, so so this balance need to be maintained, otherwise the results might be a bit lopsided. So now once they had this, they tried to do the measurements. So the first thing was measuring fairness. So they measured fairness as based on the percentage of stories without both sides getting contacted. So the unfairness level, if you recall. Okay. So percentage of stories with unfairness level. Okay, so these were the stories where the two parties were not contacted, only one of them were contacted, in fact. So the first thing that you observe here is that the unfairness average is lower for the prestige press compared to the high circulation. Okay, so it is way lower, the average is way lower compared to the high circulation, and there are quite a few uh, like uh, news outlets for which like the unfairness is 0. Okay, so they are extremely fair, so they are very very fair. Okay, so these are the ranks based on the unfairness percentage. So what we see is that first of all, for the prestige press, there are many articles or many news outlets any news outlets that are perfectly or almost perfectly fair. Okay, but for the other one, for the high circulation news papers, actually this is not the case. So here the author's hypothesis seems to be corroborated, and um, many of the high circulation newspapers have a very high unfairness percentage, okay, with some ranging like to 45.5%, 36.0%, 34.5%. So like roughly half of the news stories did not contact. So in this case, roughly half of the news stories did not contact both the parties in the controversy. Okay, so this is, and of course, like therefore, their overall ranks have gone down. However, there is one very interesting exception here is this Minneapolis Star and Tribune, which also seems to have a zero unfairness. Okay, which means that uh, uh, like it is fully or perfectly fair. Okay, so this is also therefore sharing a rank one with the other two from the um, uh, Prestige Press. Okay, so okay, so there was one thing that was like slightly mistaken. So if you look at the Prestige Press average, it is 9, whereas the high circulation average is 20. It's not 15.7. This is the overall average. Okay, so this is the overall average. Actually, the the table lines are missing. That's why it becomes a little difficult to locate. But then as you see, like it's more than double. Okay, so the unfairness for the high circulation newspapers is more than double compared to the um, Prestige Press. Okay, so the next thing that they studied naturally was the balance. And what you find here, once again, the for the Prestige Press, the average balance is 23.5, okay, or rather, let's call it imbalance. Okay, so that is the watts per inch difference between the two sides of the controversy. So let's call this as imbalance percentage. So this is 23.5 for the Prestige Press, whereas for the high circulation, the average is like 31.9. Okay, so again, we see that there is a difference, although the difference is not as pronounced as in the case of fairness. Okay, so here what we observe is that, the imbalance numbers are also not very low for the Prestige Press. Okay, for the other one, of course, they are very, very high. For the high circulation newspapers, they are pretty high. But then for the Prestige Press also, like it's always above 20%. Okay, so, however, among them, like some of the ones that are like quote unquote good ones are the New York Times, again the St. Louis Post Dispatch, the Washington Post, etc. But what was still bothering for the authors was that, so, or probably also revealing, is that although if you look just based on the fairness metric, they look like that the Prestige Press is more fair than the high circulation newspapers. However, if you look more carefully into the coverage, it seems that one side is covered typically more than the other for almost all the news outlets, whether it is Prestige Press or it is high circulation. So in high circulation, the imbalance is larger, I mean, that is what is getting apparent, but then like also for the prestige press, it's never less than 20%. So this was roughly the overall takeaway from the paper. And so they also uh, did the average of the two ranks to see like where the individual news outlets stand, and some of the top ones are of course, top rankers are of course from the prestige press. Okay, so there are some from the uh, high circulation ones, but the top ones are mostly from the prestige press. Okay, so and like from this, like they made some interesting uh, observations. So the first thing that I was telling you, like in terms of fairness, there is a greater variation, like it's from 0 to 45%. So some news agencies or some news outlets are completely fair or perfectly fair, whereas there are some which are in almost 45% of the cases they are unfair. Okay, so the again the second thing is I already told you that like the range of difference for balance is larger, sorry, is smaller compared to fairness. So in balance, like we see, like even the prestige press is not doing very well. Okay, and several of the newspapers performed well when it came to fairness, but then there are 6 papers, okay, where more than 1/4 of the stories did not cover both the sides. Okay, so these 6 newspapers were really, really uh, like something to be bothered about in the journalistic literature. So these 6 newspapers are something that is typically not welcome. So the coverage and the fairness, both of them are pretty bad for these 6 newspapers, and therefore uh, some moderation is probably required. So that was what was the thesis of the authors, that some moderation is required before these newspapers are published. Okay. So this is the first work. So we will stop here and take a break of 10 minutes, and then we will start again from 9:53.